All right, friends, let's go ahead and get started. And come on in, come on in. Welcome to everyone on this chilly Tuesday morning. Glad that you're with us. It is Tuesday, isn't it?
Yes.
I think it is. Yes, good. We're all here on the right day. So before we get started, I want to open us with just a quick word of prayer. Gracious God, as we approach this season of Advent, a season of waiting, season of anticipation, season of moving from darkness to light, we give thanks for this time together to study your word and find the truths in it that you have led us to. May our conversations today nourish us spiritually as we look forward to the birth of Christ at Christmas. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.
Amen.
So, before we get into chapter 2 of Ruth today, just wanted to see if there were any thoughts or reactions or anything that came out of last week's conversation before we move on.
I just watched it on YouTube and it was very quiet.
Well, and that's why we're sitting in a different
All
configuration
right, yeah, I
today.
had the volume up full and I couldn't hear what anyone else was saying.
Yes,
But, yeah.
and I'd heard that, so
Oh, that's all right.
hopefully it will go better today. So, but yes, yeah. So when you comment, project today, so folks at home can hear you. Well, I had a couple of follow-up notes from our conversation last week that I just wanted to kind of share. The first was, we talked at one point in last week's conversation about the meanings and the symbolism of some of the names of the characters. And Anne sent me some information from one of her resources. It's from Herbert Lockyer's All the Women of the Bible. And it talks about, in particular, the names of Naomi's sons. It says, Mahlon means the sickly one or invalid, and Chilion means the pining one or wasting away. They may have been premature twins, and from their birth, Naomi would have had to surround them with great care and attention. So, just adds a little more color.
Really give their children those sorts of names.
That gives some understanding to why they died.
Well, that's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. So also, in doing some of the work for today, I came across some information about Boaz, and I think as I mentioned last time, Boaz doesn't directly seem to have a particular meaning to it, but that it would have connotes strength and reliability. The word and when he first appears, as Ruth is in the field gleaning, he's described as a rich kinsperson, a rich family member, and the word, the Hebrew word translated as rich, can also mean powerful or highly respected. So he kind of comes with that sort of air and I don't want to say baggage, but he comes with that sort of understanding around him. So that brings us to chapter 2, and so I've got a couple of things that I want to share to kind of provide some contextual information and get us thinking about things, and then I also want to leave room for conversation. And like last week, I found way too much stuff to include in the hour, so I'm going to try to down what I'm going to share, but I wanted to talk first of all about gleaning. Most of the action in this chapter centers around Naomi sending Ruth out to glean in the fields. So what do we know about gleaning? What is it and why do people do it? Yeah.
I think it's picking up the bits that the workers don't collect when they're taking in the grain, isn't it?
Yeah.
Bits that are left lying on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was told in the law
That's right.
Yes.
that you must let the poor people do that.
Yes.
You mustn't go round twice or something like that. I mean, it's Leviticus somewhere, or one of those ones.
It is in Leviticus. So if you want to find chapter 19 of Leviticus.
Page 120.
Thanks, Ruth.
We're looking for verses 9 and 10. If anybody wants to share those when they find it.
What chapter is that?
Chapter 19, verses 9 and 10.
Shall I read that then?
Sure.
When you harvest your fields, do not cut the corn at the edges of the fields, and do not go back to cut the ears of the corn that were left. Do not go back through your vineyard to gather the grapes that were missed, or to pick up grapes that have fallen. Leave them for poor people and foreigners. I am the Lord your God.
Yeah, and it's interesting that in this particular chapter, I mean, we know Leviticus seems to be a very long list of all sorts of rules and regulations. And toward the end of that chapter, while you're there, if you look at verse 33, I think it also applies to our story. Anyone want to read verse 33?
Do not ill-treat foreigners who are living in your land. Treat them as you would a fellow Israelite, and love them as you love yourselves. Remember that you were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God.
Yeah, I think that just is interesting to think about in terms of how we think about how Ruth is treated and ultimately welcomed into that community. I think that's obviously a strong point in what this story is trying to teach. I think it's also interesting consideration for some of the discussion going on in this country about issues around immigration and things of that nature. Worth considering.
And in Israel.
And in Israel, yes, lots of places that
And America.
in America, we can make a long list, for sure. Yeah, there's a similar, in Leviticus 23, there's a similar prescription about gleaning. It's Leviticus 23, verse 22. Yeah, and I'll read it out of my translation, which is a little different than yours. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. So, certainly, yes, it's set forth in the law, and obviously was in practice, at least in this particular community around Bethlehem at the time of the story. One of the articles that I looked at talked about, but it just had some interesting stuff. That gleaning, historically, has been sort of written into the laws of a lot of Western Christian nations. It was a legal requirement here in England until the late 1700s. Where did my note go? Till 1788, the case of Steele versus Houghton. there was a wealthy family that was looking to consolidate all the land in their village, and people were gleaning on it, and they didn't like that, so they eventually took them to court, and
This is the time of the enclosures, what they're called.
yes, yeah. So, but in other European countries, well into the 1800s, this usually was codified in the law as gleaning. Also read an article that talked about modern day gleaning and talked about dumpster diving as a form of modern day gleaning, which is so people who rummage through bins and dumpsters looking for leftover food and different things. Yeah, so I just thought,
Well, recycling, I know.
well, yeah, it was a little, yeah, a little bit different take on that I hadn't thought about as kind of a form of gleaning. But the idea obviously was that it was intended to be a resource for those who didn't have enough food where they could go and gather some. So, for me at least, that brought up the question of how effective that would be as a means of sustainability. So, in the reading for today, Ruth, with a little help, comes home with an ephah of barley from her day in the fields. So, anybody recently measured something in an ephah?
The Bible says it's 10 kilograms.
10 kilograms.
It's really annoying when you get to that in the Good News Bible.
Well, the resource I found said it was 42 quarts, which may be roughly equivalent, I don't know.
10 pounds of white birches.
Yeah, yeah.
I was going to ask if that had any particular, the amount had any particular significance.
I don't think so, but it would have been apparently enough to feed 2 people for between 5 and 7 days. So it was a goodly amount.
Well, that was after she got the extra, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, she had
Yes.
some help, yes. Yes. But the challenge is that the harvest season for barley and then for wheat, they were kind of back to back. If you remember at the end of chapter 1, it says they arrived in Bethlehem during the barley harvest. So traditionally, that harvest season lasted for 7 weeks. So the farmers would be in their fields during that time. Gleaning would have taken place, but in a lot of ways, the length of time you could glean in the fields was dictated by the amount of time they spent harvesting in the fields. I suppose you could a little bit after the harvest, but the food would not, would eventually go bad. So I think it's interesting to think about gleaning having a very limited time period, that even if you were able to glean, apparently what Ruth brings home is kind of an unusual amount. But even if you were able to do that and you had a way to preserve the grains and whatever it is that you're bringing home, it's still a very small chunk of the entire year. And so there would have been other either expectations that help would come from other areas of the community, or it just occurred. So anyway, a little glimpse into gleaning and how it was practiced. The other thing that I will mention is we talked a little bit, there were some questions last week about Moab. We talked about the origins of Moab, the biblical origins of it. And we had the map in the Bible that kind of demonstrated where it was. So I did a little more looking into that. Moab was the country to the east of Judah across the Dead Sea. And there's ample historical evidence of the existence of Moab and some of its kings and some of its political and military history. And it's believed that the original Moabites probably immigrated from the Arabian Peninsula and therefore may have been visually distinctive to people living in ancient Palestine. And what I had totally forgotten until I was reading is Moab is the point from which the Israelites move into the Promised Land. It's where Moses gives his sermon of Deuteronomy and eventually dies in the land of
So
Moab.
Jericho's near there, is it?
I would have to check, but yeah,
Jericho's just at the north end of the Dead Sea, so it's sort of in the middle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's supposed to be the, when they.
yeah, but anyway, so I guess there's even that story that's kind of in the background of what, another story of people moving from one land to another that's in the background. What else can I bore you with? Okay. I tell you what comments and thoughts and questions do you have about action in the second chapter? And if my other topics don't come up, I'll come back to them at the end.
Boaz seems to have rather picked Ruth out, doesn't he? You know, the fact that he's told told her where she should work and help yourself to the water and come and eat with us and dip your bread in the sauce, which seemed a bit strange, but there you go. That's so I think he'd rather spotted her, so to speak.
Yes, yeah. I
He's
think
given her a
that's-
lot of extra
doesn't-
attention.
Doesn't mention anything about whether he's already married at this
No,
point.
I was
or what
wondering
family. I
that.
mean, if he's a rich and powerful
Must
man,
be.
surely he would have a wife and maybe inherited some more land that way.
Yeah,
And.
but I don't know
the
that
next-
always
but
would
it
have been a
says-
problem.
No,
Well,
but later, just at the beginning of chapter 3, it says later. So
Yes.
was he a widower then, or? We
Um,
don't know anything, but it says
Don't
he's a
know how much
kinsman, so
later.
it's almost like he's been parachuted in
Do we don't
to
even-
fit this story.
We don't
No,
even,
the thing about, the point that we have to remember is that right at the beginning, Naomi and Elimelech sold their property, sold their land back into the family because they were going to Moab, to Moab. And the reason they were going to Moab was that there was famine where they were. And therefore they were going, and that's where these funny names of the sons
Yeah.
are significant. She was trying to protect her sons. So that there was almost a duty of care that they should be allowed to glean in these
Yes.
these fields.
Yeah.
Because some of them had probably belonged to them, you know.
That's true.
And she wouldn't have been the only person who
No.
went abroad at that point.
No.
No.
when we come to wives, of course, I'm not quite sure where this fits in chronologically, but early on, polygamy was practiced, so it doesn't have to be a widow or anything like that.
Doesn't get any mention at all.
No.
I think one of the things as well, if you look at verse 9, is perhaps how people were treated by some, is I have ordered my men not to molest you.
Yes,
Mm.
yes.
Yeah.
Well,
Which is
so,
interesting in light of that other bit of Leviticus about looking after foreigners.
looking after foreigners, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, when Boaz comes out, I mean, it's almost liturgical, you know, may the Lord be with you, or something to that effect, he says to his servants, and they respond back to him, and he has kind of that air of, I don't know, maybe not purity, but just that sort of, you know, very righteousness
It's not
sort
the
of
sort of
thing.
usual greeting you get from the boss, is it?
Yes, yes, yeah. Yeah, but it seems it may not carry all the way down to
Well,
the workers.
Suggests he was playing fast and loose with the laws on gleaning and letting his servants be violent towards the gleaners.
Oh, yeah, well, could be, could be.
Was it the custom that if somebody was widowed, for example, she would be looked after by the family of her husband? Was that how it went, or was it just
Yes.
this was a particularly nice man?
No, no.
No, I mean, the expectation would certainly have been that one of the other men in the family would marry her,
Oh, yes, yeah.
and prolong the family line, in that way. But certainly, in general, there would have been some expectation of that. Now, she is in a unique situation because she has no direct male
Yeah.
relative now. Her husband's dead, her sons are dead, and plus she has a foreigner, a widowed foreigner with her, which Naomi's prospects might have been marginal returning to Bethlehem, assuming she's at least what at the time would have been a more advanced age. She's not going to have more children. She's probably not prime marriage material in that system. And then she comes with someone else. That's probably even more of a precarious.
It looks like she's not well enough to go out herself into the fields.
Yeah.
Because she says, no, oh, you go, I'll stay here, sort of thing. Maybe she just, couldn't bend down anymore.
It could be.
Maybe she thought Ruth would have a better chance of attracting help. Just
Could be.
her husband.
Could be. Could be.
Better legs or something.
Well, and I think the fact that the word molest is used, it does have kind of a sexual overtone to it, and probably suggests that Ruth was a younger, attractive, more attractive woman. So let me, kind of on that subject, do you think Ruth knew, because it's kind of confusing if you go back and really read the beginning of that chapter, did Ruth know whose field it was she was going to?
Naomi knew who Boaz was, because
Yes.
it says that man's a close relative of ours, one of those responsible for taking care of us. So I've been very surprised if Naomi didn't tell Ruth to go and herself,
Yeah.
if she knew who he was and Boaz knew who they both were, and it's
But
just
the-
come from
The end of
Bethlehem,
verse 3
then-
says it's by chance. That
Well,
so happens to
so
be.
happens.
I mean,
yeah,
it's,
I know,
it's
but
almost like a bit of someone telling a joke.
why would Naomi not tell Ruth to go and to start there? Maybe
Yeah.
But it's in verse 2, it's Ruth who, in the story, takes the initiative about going into the field.
yeah.
Yes, yes, yeah.
You can still be led to take the initiative, though, can't you? Without just telling you to sort of whatever,
Well, I think,
Do you think she didn't want Naomi to know that she'd already chosen which field to go to? So she just says, let me go into the fields in general, but she already sort of worked out that this guy Boaz might be a good.
So what is the relevance of I'm sure to find someone who'll let me work with him? Surely you glean, you just glean. Why does she need someone to work with her?
I think the idea was you followed one particular reaper with their, with their sickle, so you picked it up
yeah,
behind them, sort of.
but I think the narrative has really kind of a sort of passive-aggressive kind of approach to it in, obviously Boaz is identified. Naomi identifies Boaz to Ruth, at least by name. And then it's a little unclear, it says she happened into Boaz's field, and he doesn't seem to know who she is when he first arrives on the scene.
later on he says, I've heard about everything you've done for your mother-in-law since your husband died.
Yes.
So he has heard
So,
of her.
yes, so it's,
This thing about tipping in the sauce, does that mean that she was sort of sitting next to him in the picnic? Because you only shared it with the people near him.
yeah, I think so. I mean, I think she definitely gets some preferential treatment, yeah.
Sort of fondue sort of.
So I don't know ultimately if it matters, if she knew where she was going or not, but I think it does play into how, when we read this, how we think about it, because I think obviously, if it's Naomi and Ruth kind of concocting this plan to, oh, we'll go out and flirt with Boaz and whatnot, then it's kind of one direction, and if it's Naomi who says, oh, go to the fields, knowing that this may happen, and Ruth doesn't know what's going on, then it's kind of a whole different situation for Ruth in that moment, I would think.
I mean, were they just interested in getting some food at this point? Or
It doesn't,
was she on the pause?
it doesn't talk about, yes. Well, obviously, they ate quite a bit of what he prepared for them, because it talks about Ruth ate until she was satisfied, and then took the leftovers home, and Naomi ate until she was satisfied, so,
Well, that wouldn't be normal for gleaners, would it?
I wouldn't think so, no.
The thing is, Ruth is quite a high spirited person, isn't she? So, and if Naomi would have known that, so she wouldn't. If Ruth had been told by Naomi that about this, to go and play up to this man or whatever, she probably wouldn't do that. She would. So Naomi, knowing her daughter-in-law, I'm speaking from experience here, would not tell her to go and whatever, because she'd go and do the opposite, or she wouldn't, and then she would act unnaturally. So she would, maybe even Boaz and Naomi plotted this or whatever. But Ruth, I would think, didn't know. This is my opinion. Didn't know. Otherwise, I think she would have acted differently, and being that sort of person. Is my opinion.
A very strong-willed woman.
Yeah, that's right. Who wouldn't? Yes, just go take the easier option or whatever, and play up to Boaz. But because she didn't know and she was whatever, that's how I think of it.
Yeah.
It's almost as if it's a woman actually writing this story down, but it wasn't, was it? It must have been relayed.
Well, but it also could have been, I mean, I think, originally it very well could have been a story told by a woman, that was transmitted orally until such time that it was written down,
At the same time, Ruth was in a very vulnerable situation, wasn't she? She
It would
was
seem
one,
so.
a foreigner, and two, a widow,
yeah,
with no sons to protect her. All she has is her mother-in-law.
yeah.
So, she must have surely been thinking, I need to find a husband. That's my only way of protecting myself. I mean, I don't know. I'm just
No,
assuming,
I would think that would have had to have been on anyone in her position's mind to seek protection. Yeah, I mean, that was the only way to really secure it, so.
And not to be molested, because at the end of the chapter,
So
Naomi
same
says
thing,
to Ruth, carry on working there, you might be molested if you went to somebody else's field. It's fair game.
Well, Boaz said,
She recognises her position as a foreigner, but she's...
I mean, that just tells you what.
But could she even get a potential husband as a Jew with a foreigner? I mean, that wasn't the norm in those days, was it?
Well, probably not, but she's also coming from a background where she had married a Jew.
Oh, right.
So, I don't know, I mean, I think part of it comes down to how people in that community read and understood the law, you know, obviously when these different things occurred, I mean, most of the Jews at that time would have been perhaps not literate to have read it, but they would certainly know the law and would immediately sort of view any sort of situation through that lens. Now, I mean, obviously the threat of molestation is not part of the law, so, you know, it wasn't, there obviously were risks, but, yeah. Well, I just think I think it also opens up, depending how you read it, whether Naomi and Ruth were in cahoots together to go out and get her married, or whether Naomi manipulated the situation in such a way to push her in that direction, or whether it was purely a spirit thing that she shows up and Boaz shows up and they like each other or whatever. I think it gives us room to think about the ways that, I mean, obviously it's included in the Bible. It was an important spiritual text for generations and generations and generations. So is this a story about the Spirit working through people to coordinate a desired outcome? Or is it a story about the Spirit itself creating the situation where the outcome occurs? Does that make sense?
In verse 20, Naomi implies that it's God's work.
Yes, yeah.
After this chapter, Naomi drops out of the story altogether. There's no more mention of her.
Oh, until the very end, yeah.
Oh, it mentioned,
Yeah.
yeah, but it's almost like her work's done.
Yeah.
She's got, and obviously she's saying, well, you don't even be seen with near any other men. Well, you keep yourself close to Boaz almost. Well, at least by working in it,
Yeah.
so that your allegiances are clear. And I didn't realise. I didn't notice it was, she mentioned right at the end. It said that we don't know what happened to her, or you know whether she lived to an old age or something like that.
Yeah.
She just presumably she would have been taken in by Boaz and Ruth. Do you think?
I would think.
But that's later in the story.
Going back to Leviticus, couldn't also this be a reminder to the people of how to treat foreigners and aliens in their country?
Very much. Yes, I think that's. Yes, I think that's a big.
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
How to actually a reminder to the people, taking it back to Leviticus, of how to treat foreigners and aliens in your country where they
And
come.
Boaz had a reputation for that.
Yes.
Sounds like a good boss, doesn't it?
So one of the things.
When workers, they all say, bless you.
One of the things that I came across in working on my notes for this that I thought was kind of interesting is that there's a scene, there's a part in chapter 2 where Boaz is giving instructions to Ruth, and I'm trying to find it real quick.
Verse 8.
Oh, yes,
Yeah, where he talks about, yes, it's towards the end of verse 9. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. And so there's a well in this field where they're getting water. So obviously just from that, it would seem like as a gleaner, you would not be entitled to go and also take from the well. I mean, she gets permission to do that. But one of the commentaries I read talked about how people who read or heard this story at the time that it was originally told would have recognized a betrothal trope in ancient literature, that kind of a recurring theme in ancient literature was a man comes into a town that he's not familiar with. He goes to the well, there's a woman at the well, he asks for a drink, and they wind up getting married. So we can, if we think about it, it's the story of Jacob and Rachel. Jacob goes back to Laban's farm and comes across a well and inquires about, is this Laban's and whatnot, and eventually Rachel comes up and their story goes on from there.
She was a foreigner too, wasn't she? She's from another. Oh, sorry.
I don't know. I'd have to look at
I was
that again.
thinking of Jesus and the Samaritan.
Well, Jesus and the Samaritan woman certainly is.
Another echo.
It's the same echo. Obviously, not the same outcome, but what the Samaritan woman, Jesus comes in, the Samaritan woman is drawing water, he asks for a drink, and then they have this whole conversation about how many husbands she has and all these sorts of things. But what she gets from that encounter is not marriage, but she gets redemption. And so in the story of Ruth, there's so much around redemption, both spiritually, but also literally, that, in the end, Ruth gets married, and that sort of redeems her because it gives her status and a future and hope. And so, anyway, I just throw that out there as, those aren't, that's not necessarily something we would pick up on just reading this, but chances are someone, at the time that this would have been written down, would have recognized that, it's like going to a panto, right? And if you don't know the rules, you don't understand what's going on, but it's, I say that from experience, but
Over there.
once you figure it out, then you see you see all the little references and such, so I'll just, I'll throw that out. Something else I was gonna.
When they came back, it wasn't just to come back to where she was before, but jumping on in chapter 4, she actually still owned a field that belonged to her husband.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, but it was probably being tenanted.
Could Boaz's family be, or his father or that, be one of the beneficiaries when the land was sold, when they first left the country?
Well, he could have sold it to him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's still within the family.
Yeah, the whole ownership is kind of interesting because it doesn't seem like Naomi has any resources. She returns, obviously they must be living somewhere. Doesn't really explain how that came about. And they seem somewhat dependent upon the food that Ruth has gleaned. So it doesn't seem like they're fully supporting themselves. But then it comes, the land comes up at the end, which is interesting. We'll get into that when we get to chapter 4 a little bit. But what do you think that says? Does that influence how you read the story?
Well, it gave her more of a reason to come back with relatives and the possibility of selling this field.
Yeah, yeah. That's true. Yeah, it would give incentive for sure.
But would she have inherited her late husband's estate and land? She's left home, gone to Moab for years. She's still entitled
Kids
to.
inherited their own right.
I'll have to do some looking because it could have been that some sort of situation when they left that Elimelech had some sort of agreement that the field went into ownership or control of Boaz or someone in the family until he came back. I don't know if there were such agreements that might be possible, but
I thought she went back as well because it says in verse 6 of chapter 1, sometime later Naomi heard that the Lord had blessed his people by giving them a good harvest. So she got ready to leave Moab with her daughters.
It's all very much based around her husband. I can never pronounce his name.
yeah.
But what about her family? She would have had a family around there as well, so maybe she went back because
No,
her
no,
family.
no, she marries into, by Jewish law, she married into his family.
And that's
So
it.
she
You
gets
forget
the
her
right
original
to that.
family. Yeah, that's end of, is it?
Yeah.
So she would have, for her own family would be out of it completely.
Yeah.
No responsibility for her.
Yet she suggests that Ruth and her other daughter-in-law go back to their family.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which sort of contradicts the
Mm.
law.
Yes, because they would have, by marrying into the Jewish family.
Jewish
Mm.
by marrying Jews, would then automatically become Jewish?
Yeah. Well, it's what I thought you had to convert.
Yeah.
You really
It's
think.
interesting because in our history, yes, legally, that any powerful women in past centuries would have been widows and possibly who had several husbands, like Bess of Hardwick or people like that.
Yeah.
And they only got their lands and what have you because of that. They didn't have any other
They were
heirs.
better off, weren't they, as a widow?
Yes.
Because if they married again, everything would go to
Yeah.
their next husband.
Oh, am I right? Is it Bess of Hardwick? She had
Yes, yeah.
three husbands or something. But, you know, most of them were in the landed gentry, so she was actually piling it up.
Well, it is interesting though, and I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but, you know, what Ruth says to Naomi in that first chapter, among those things is, your people shall be my people and your God,
Yeah.
my God.
Mm.
So I think that's interesting in sort of that conversation about if and when some sort of, what we would call conversion would take place. Or was Moab culture different where they could marry and, you know, be like someone here who belonged to this church but married a Catholic and they just did their own thing, you know, was it, you know, that sort of thing or not? But,
When she said your God will be my God, does that mean she's going to accept all their laws?
well, I mean, it seems like a total surrender.
Whole package.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But wasn't there a tradition at that point if you went to another country, you took on the gods from that country?
I would think at the very least that would be the safe thing to do.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's, I think that's part of it.
And it was the Israelites who were the one who changed that by refusing to worship the gods in the
Mhm.
countries where they would
Yeah.
stay.
Yeah.
That's why they're always being attacked for it.
So in chapter 2, verse 12, Boaz gives a sort of blessing over Ruth. And he specifically identifies, may the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. So I think looking back to what she says in chapter 1, that's kind of an acknowledgement that she's now under the protection of the God of Israel. And and that's how that would be understood, which connects to that particular blessing and terminology, connects to Psalm 91, which again, I think a lot of the original hearers of this story would have immediately, heard the connection and the similarity in language. So Psalm 91 says, "You who live in the shelter of the Most High, who abide in the shadow of the Almighty, will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. For he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and buckler. You will not fear the terror of the night, or the arrow that flies by day, or the pestilence that stalks in darkness, or the destruction that wastes at noonday." And then a little later, "Because you have made the Lord your refuge, the Most High, your dwelling place, no evil shall befall you, no scourge come near your tent."
This is Upminster, isn't it? Mighty fortress.
Well, yeah, yes, it is.
Echoes of when Jesus was tempted by the devil.
Yes,
So the angels will hold you up with their hands and keep you from hurting your feet on the stones.
he kind of refers to that, doesn't he?
Mm.
Yes, yeah.
Um,
But I think also in that is that sense of security that you have trusted in the God of Israel, who now has you under his wing, under his protection. So I think that I think obviously the implication is that at least by that point she has made that transition, whether or not she had, prior to their journey back to Bethlehem or not.
These Psalms reflect how the Israelites in general perceived God.
Yes.
Why they should stay with him, so to speak.
Yes, yeah. So how does that relate then to Ruth? What do you think? Boaz obviously is playing the role of the protector here. There'll be some play on words between taking under his wings, and then in the next chapter when he's covered. I think there's a intentional kind of play on words as we get to the action in chapter 3.
This would have gone on for how many weeks of the harvest, wouldn't it? I mean, we read it and it all happens in one day, but this would have been going on for 9 weeks or something. So it would have been a gradual
It very well could have
coming
been, yeah.
together rather than which here is a bit of a.
This is sort of a compilation of all of that.
It would have taken longer, wouldn't it?
Could have
Yeah.
been. I think certainly there's that at least little bit of time between chapter 2 and chapter 3. Chapter 2 ends and says, she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. And so knowing that depending where they were when they arrived, you know, it potentially was as much as seven-ish weeks.
Or twice that, because it was barley and wheat.
Well, I think together they were 7 weeks, was what I read.
Oh, right, I
Yeah.
thought there were 7 weeks each.
No, I think together they were 7 weeks.
Come
Yeah.
together.
Seven sounds like a convenient biblical amount.
No, it does, it does,
Yes,
it does,
yes.
yes. I thought that as well. But,
So do you do the threshing at the end of the harvest then?
That's to stand in the
The
fields,
threshing
doesn't
is the harvest,
Yeah.
it's harvesting, isn't it?
Oh, I thought it was like beating it to get the
No,
grains
no,
out.
no, no, no,
Oh.
no.
but they've got to, yeah, you have to
that-
stand it in the stooks and all that,
Yeah.
it took a lot.
Okay.
and it is confusing because the action in the next chapter takes place on the threshing floor. So we'll talk a little bit about that
Yeah.
next time and how that functions as a,
That was the sort of, that, in days past, that's what the agricultural workers did in the winter. Because it was an indoor work that needed quite a lot of people.
yeah,
The places like the Tide Bar here.
that's right, that's right, that's right. All right, well, any other thoughts? We're getting into chapters 3 and 4, which if we do that today, we won't have anything to do next week.
It's 2 weeks. Is there any significance at the end of the closing words of that chapter that says, and she continued to live with her mother-in-law?
Where else she would go.
Is that to suggest that he didn't seduce her or invite her back home sort of thing?
I think maybe it's,
She's the Jew.
Yeah.
maybe it's that and just kind of giving that space between what's happened in chapter 2 and what's gonna happen in chapter 3
Yeah.
to, well, to go back to
Your namesake.
what Pam had mentioned with the, you know, if this is a consolidation of things that happened over a period of time, or whether it was the events of a particular day, that there was at least a modest gap before they moved on to more serious courtship, or whatever it is that happens in chapter 3, which we will talk about.
We'll be
We're not supposed to have read yet.
But I think
Later next
that's
week.
probably,
Oh,
I think that's probably the purpose of it, so.
Yeah.
The thing that struck me was how Ruth feels reassured by Boaz, because in verse 13 she said, "You are very kind to me, sir. You have made me feel better by speaking gently to me, even though I am not the equal of one of your servants." Which really perhaps shows, you know, just how vulnerable she is.
Yes, yeah. And I think to that, kind of the same point, if you watch in this chapter, and probably going forward, how more times than not, Ruth is identified as either Ruth, the Moabite, or Ruth, the daughter-in-law. And it's almost like she's playing two different roles to some extent. But, I mean, so granted, most of the time when she's identified as daughter-in-law, it's when she's speaking with Naomi. But it also strikes me that this far into the story, why is she continually reminded that she's the daughter-in-law? I mean, there's gotta be some significance to that. I think the repetition of the Moabite part just goes to the larger theme of the story that, don't forget, she's a foreigner and all this is happening. So I'm not sure if it's kind of the same thing with Naomi.
But in verse 22, she calls her daughter, doesn't she? Naomi said to Ruth, "Yes, my
Yeah.
daughter."
Yeah,
That's interesting, isn't it?
yeah.
How old would Boaz be in relation to Naomi?
Anybody's guess.
You know, it's
We
kind of
don't know.
hard to say,
Mm.
although it would seem he was older, you know, it would,
older than Naomi.
Oh, I'm sorry, than Naomi.
Probably because Elimelech was old, would have been older than
Likely been older than
and
Naomi.
he was one of the kin, isn't he?
Yeah,
So probably.
yeah, but there's not really any, aside from identification of being kin, there's not necessarily any kind of reference that,
We don't know the exact relationship
Yeah.
between Naomi.
There's a suggestion in chapter 3 that he's older.
Yes.
When you get to that, because it says you might have gone looking for a young man, which
Yes.
suggests he isn't.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
This is after the time when different parts of the country were lots of different tribes.
Yes,
So they'd have all been in the same tribe, whichever tribe settled in Bethlehem.
yes. Well, yeah, tribe of Judah, right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So they could all claim kinship that way. Or
Well-
was that going back too far? Did they have this
I
thing,
bet-
well,
I
we
bet
don't-
it was
we don't get
more-
on with the Benjaminites or the
Yeah,
or the what have you. There's
But I bet
things
this-
about that going on in Judges, don't there?
but I bet this is more literal family, I
Yeah.
think. I think it would have to be, because otherwise their traditions about sort of keeping property within the family and such would really, it could really get messy if, oh, I like that, well, I'll just go over and I'm kin to them, so, yeah. And then, and the point about the age of Boaz, you know, he kind of self-reveals that he's older, but keeping in mind, you know, at this time, life expectancy was probably mid-40s. And so, you know, Naomi at some point, I think, kind of, well, she talks about she's too old to have kids and she's too old to attract a husband. I mean, she may be, you know, in her late 30s, because they would have married when they were early teens. So, so I think he, you know, he is older than Ruth, but I think in our standards of thinking about age difference, it's on a whole different scale than
In verse 20, it says, that man is a close relative of ours, one of those responsible for taking care of us. So that suggests that Boaz actually had a duty to take care of them.
Yeah.
Right? And also it says us, so he's got a duty to take care of Ruth as well as Naomi.
yeah.
Yeah, that's what she said.
Well, and if you think back to the language that we were reading out of Leviticus earlier, I mean, it talked about gleaning, that one verse talks specifically about foreigners. But if you read through all of it, there would be multiple references to obligations to family, to community, et cetera. So, yeah,
So when he's allowing them to glean, actually that's his obligation to allow them to glean, really.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, so it's just a matter of
Yeah.
who knew she was coming to do it
Yeah.
or not, yeah, yeah.
With this, all these explanatory names and what have you,
Yep.
are these real people or is the whole thing an allegory?
Well,
Except, and the little bit at the end is sort of saying, well, actually, it is sort of a get out of that. But I don't know, it just seems.
what you mean when he's, because it talks about them.
No, it
being-
gives, well, no, where it gives the genealogy.
Yes,
Yeah.
it says that they're, it leads into David, doesn't it? So-
Yes.
Yeah, but
Yes,
these
the very end.
represent concepts rather than real
Yeah,
people.
yeah. Is it a parable?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Well, we will talk about that at the end, because I think that is a valid, I think it's a valid question,
Oh, sorry about that.
valid question.
It all seems too good, it all seems to fit into place too easily.
Well, we can talk about similarities to Job and to other Old Testament stories that kind of have similar endings to them, but,
Six.
All right, so this is another Taizé chant. This is Wait for the Lord. I picked this one because I thought that it tied in, not just with the action in Ruth that we've been discussing today, where Ruth and Naomi are kind of waiting for God to swoop in and help them out, but also as we enter into Advent proper here on Sunday. It's a period of waiting and longing for God. And so one of the things I didn't make clear last week is, as you listen to it, if you feel led to sing along, please do. And if you don't and just want to listen, that's fine as well. But this is Wait for the Lord. It's says it's based on Psalm 27, but I think it's probably based on an awful lot of different things. So.